How's it going, everybody? This is the Uncanny Omar from Near Mint Condition, the home of collected editions. And today I'm going to be talking to this gentleman to my right. This is Rich Davis. How are you, sir? Thank you for joining me.
I am doing better than I deserve, man. Thank you so much for the invite.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to this conversation. You are a comic creator, but why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, like how you got started in comics and what hooked you? What was the thing about comics that made you go, I want to do this. I want to write comic books.
It's kind of funny. I know a lot of people that that you interview, a lot of creators. This has been a lifelong dream of theirs. They knew when they were 5 they wanted to be a comic creator. I wasn't one of those people. I kind of came into it a little bit late in life. I've only been writing comics since about 2015. So my life has been many things, but it's never been boring. I've worked as an actor and a tech in the film industry. I owned a theater for 10 years, produced well over 100 plays. I've worked as a screenwriter in the film industry, a playwright. I've been a talk radio DJ host, and I then owned a comic book store and was working as a screenwriter. And I'd written a play back then called Dracula Reimagined, and we had it produced at the Browncoat Pub and Theater in Wilmington, North Carolina. Ran for an entire month of sold out shows and won several North Carolina theater awards. And just out of happenstance, the great Tony Todd, the Candyman, happened to attend one of the performances of Dracula Reimagined. And when it was finished, he stayed after and chatted with me. And he's like, Rich, I think you really got something here, and I don't want you to let it go. So Tony and I started working on adapting it into a feature film. But then my wife became very ill, and I had to give up on the film project because I just couldn't. Our initial intent was to produce it on like $150,000-$200,000 budget, something super micro budget, small, and kind of do it ourselves. But with Amber being ill, that became an impossibility. So I gave up. I actually deleted the script, my script folder on Dropbox, everything. And Amber got so pissed at me. She's never been angrier at me in my life. And she just yelled at me about giving up and how she didn't want me to do that. And so we came to an idea. It's like, okay, look, we can't afford to adapt this into a film. We don't have the resources or the time right now because we need to focus on getting her well. But why don't we look into turning it into a comic book? And, I was like, well, writing a comic script isn't so very different from writing a screenplay. They have far more in common, comics and screenplays, than comics and regular novels. It's a completely different skill set that you need. So I started looking around. I was very fortunate. I'd made a lot of friends in the industry over the years. And I called some of them up. Georges Genti was one of the first. He does Firefly Comics, working on the X-Men now. Done a lot of great stuff. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Serenity, all that. But anyway, I called Georges up and I was like, man, I've got, you've seen the script and everything, and I want to turn it into a comic book. How do I do that? And Georges was very kind to introduce me to Henry Martinez from Ghost Rider. And I had some other friends that I put phone calls in, and they were very kind to kind of show me the ropes and help me get going. And so, here I am today. My 18th single issue comic is due to hit shelves next month. And, things couldn't be better.
Wow. Well, that's a really interesting, let's just call it an origin story, right?
Right. Yeah.
You're right. Most people that get into comics are huge fans of comics that are like, oh my gosh, I gotta write this one day, I gotta draw this one day. You came about it, like you said, later on in life, and you came about it from something that was supposed to be a movie that got turned into a comic book, which honestly reminds me of like things like, Frank Miller, The Man Without Fear, was supposed to be a movie, the origin of Daredevil. Yep. And then He was like, you know what? Let's just whatever. Like,
Yeah.
here you go, Marvel. Here's 5 issues. Origin of Daredevil. There you go.
Sometimes it happens that way, you know. I've been reading comics since I was a little kid. I love comic books. I just never really imagined that I'd be fortunate enough to be able to write them for a living. You know, it's yeah, those are just things you don't normally dream about. You don't think, oh yeah, like I can do that.
Mhm.
But I got to tell you, if you guys are out there watching and you want to get into comics, if I can do this, trust me, anybody can do this. So, you know, just put the work in, and you can get your script done.
What was it that inspired you when you were writing the script? What was it like? Did you have comic books growing up that you were like, "Oh, this is really cool," or did you grow up around comics? I see Thor, I see Sandman,
Oh,
and
sure,
I
yeah.
see Paul Dini's the Alex Ross drawing. That statue. My wife loves that statue.
Oh, I do too. It's beautiful.
So what was it that inspired you? Like when you were growing up, what were the comics that talked to you?
You know, when I was a kid, I loved reading things like Captain America and GI Joe. My grandfather was a Marine, 36 years. Learned a lot from him, and I always had a high respect for him. And in my mind, Captain America was my grandfather. You know, so I loved reading those comics when I was younger. Then I got into Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men.
Yes.
Loved it, and I actually read Age of Apocalypse before I read the Dark Phoenix saga and all that good stuff. And I absolutely barely knew who the X-Men were at the time, but I loved this alternate universe where they, you know, what I was seeing on the X-Men, the animated series was, you know, the characters I recognized just with different hats on. And I thought that was so cool. And then from X-Men, I graduated into Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man's probably to this day my favorite superhero comic. I just love the character. I love characters who are characters of tragedy and sacrifice, which is why I prefer Spider-Man and Superman to Batman, for an example.
Mhm.
Batman's had a lot of tragedy, but he's not really had a whole lot of sacrifice. You know, it's kind of hard for me to root for, you know, now trillionaire who can just solve everything by saying, "Oh yeah, I had that in my lab. We were working on it in research." You know, I prefer more grounded. It's hard to say Superman's grounded, but you know, he is grounded in those Smallville roots. So I prefer those types of characters more so than what maybe some of the mainstreams. You know, your Iron Mans, your Batman, Wolverine. Not that those aren't great characters; they're just not really what I'm going to gravitate toward.
Yeah, everybody gravitates towards different characters. But it's funny that you said Superman grounded, because there was a comic, the title of a little event called Superman Grounded,
I
where he's
remember.
just walking. Right? It's the what was it? The JMS run. It was the JMS run
Yeah,
on
I think you're
Superman.
correct.
He's walking around America,
Yep.
which actually was kind of fun. Okay, so let's go back to comics. Uh, you have worked on Cult of Dracula, and what other works have you done, and what are you currently working on?
Yeah, so Cult of Dracula is probably my most well-known comic. Came out, you know, real quick bullet point story. We originally released it in 2019, issue 1 through a company called Second Sight Publishing. It was literally their first comic book. They'd
Okay.
never published one before. And issue 1 of Cult of Dracula sold so many copies, they couldn't afford to print issue 2. That was no fault of theirs. They were just a small company. They didn't have the infrastructure in place, and nobody in their world, in their right mind, expected Cult of Dracula to come out of the gate from a company nobody's heard of, a creator nobody's heard of, and sell 10,000 units. But that's what happened. So Second Sight was very kind. They could have been jerks. They could have tied this up in, you know, in legal issues and not allowed me to get out there. But they were kind. They realized that they had taken the book as far as they could. And so they hooked me up with Source Point Press.
Mhm.
And Source Point, we went back in, we reprinted Cult of Dracula #1. It came out, Cult of Dracula #1 was a top 50 best-selling comic of 2021 when it was finally released through Source Point Press. It went on to sell exceptionally well. It was immediately optioned and subsequently sold. to a company called BR Films, and they're currently developing Cult of Dracula into a feature film. Fingers crossed that the strikes resolve themselves, but the plan is to start lensing in April of 2024. So it will be coming full circle, from being an abandoned screenplay to being a comic, and now it's a screenplay again. So that's really cool. And then the success of Cult drove me into both Rise of Dracula, which was the sequel, and I'm working on Reign of Dracula, which is the third volume in the saga, which will come out in 2024. And currently, I have a brand new book on the shelves called Prometheus in Chains. It's a play on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein set in the post-World War II atomic age, right here, Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In this world, both Victor and Elizabeth Frankenstein are two of the brilliant Jewish scientists who fled Nazi Germany in 1939. That part's true. That scientists did flee Germany. They came to the U.S. They worked on the Manhattan Project. A lot of them right here. I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. Oak Ridge is literally my neighboring city. So they came here. They worked on the Manhattan Project, and in so doing, Elizabeth is unfortunately exposed to high levels of radiation. She passes away from cancer, and that death is what sends Victor into a spiral of depression, addiction, and an obsession with bringing her back to life. So rather than looking at Victor as an arrogant person who just thinks he's better than the gods, we look at Victor from a grief perspective. It's his grief and his loss that are driving him to conquer death and to create the creature. And I think that makes him a much more human story. I love Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's one of my all-time favorite stories, and every time it's adapted into a new format or new medium, I'm going to consume it because I absolutely love it. But I have to admit, I was a little bit bored reading stories and watching movies about an arrogant prick who just decided to conquer death for no other reason than he could. So I wanted to give Victor more humanity, some more emotional oomph to explore. And, I really think I've pulled that off with Prometheus in Chains.
And this story is very personal to you.
Very much so. So we mentioned earlier, my wife became very ill. She became ill around 2014, 2015. Ultimately, she did pass away in 2020. She needed a kidney transplant, and there were complications with the surgery, and she didn't make it.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. It doesn't matter how many times I tell people that, it never gets any easier. That's life living with PTSD. It's there always. So, I did develop post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, things like that. So Prometheus in Chains is, without sugarcoating it, as Victor's working through his shit in the book, that's me working through my shit in real life. It's a journey into, it's a descent into madness, and someone just falling apart. Obviously it's dramatized for the comic, but it's a very real story. And those are things that a lot of us, especially men, we suffer from PTSD, and we don't talk about it because we're raised, boys don't cry, suck it up, buttercup, all that shit. We're taught to, bury our emotions rather than to face them. So I think that creates a huge problem for us as we get to be adults, because there are a lot of men, veterans, especially police officers, first responders, a lot of people dealing with PTSD out there, and they have no idea what to do. And there's a very high suicide rate amongst people with PTSD. So my hope with this book, if it can accomplish anything, we do include the National PTSD Hotline number on the back cover and the inside front cover of every single copy of Prometheus in Chains. My hope is that one person, just one, who's reading that book about a character, a man going through post-traumatic stress disorder, written by a man dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe they'll see that they're not alone. And maybe instead of picking up a gun, they pick up a phone. And if we can get one person to do that, then this entire experience has been worth it. It's been worth the cathartic hell that I've had to go through in writing it. But you know, if you are listening out there and you are dealing with PTSD, or you know someone who is, talk to them. Talk to somebody. When you reach out, you're going to be very surprised at how many people reach back. You are not alone out there, and you are not the only person suffering. I can promise you that. If you can't find anybody else to reach out to me. I'm out there on social media everywhere. Just reach out. I promise you I'll answer.
Rich, when did you start this story?
I started Prometheus in Chains early 2021. Amber passed away in December of 2020. So I think I put pen to page around late February, early March on Prometheus.
And was it hard at first?
It was hard the entire time. I mean, I have never, when I tell people that writing this book was hell, I mean that. I don't know what hell is like, but I can't imagine it being any worse than that. There was not a single day writing this book that I didn't finish my writing session in tears. There were many occasions where I would write something, and it's immediately upon finishing the page, I'd turn around and vomit into this little trash can I have. It was walking around, and my background primarily comes from theater. So as an actor, I was very well trained in creating characters, and you have to learn to walk around in a character's head. And I use that in my writing, and I think the ultimate result is it makes my characters very real and authentic. But walking around for 8-10 months in Victor Frankenstein's head, constantly forcing me to confront my nightmares, really, and the terrible things that I'd gone through. It was difficult. I found myself withdrawing from my friends more, spending more and more times locked in my office writing, which now I look back and I'm like, damn, I was mirroring exactly what Victor was doing. He's, thrown himself into his work. He's locked himself into his lab. He's struggling with a lot more addiction problems than I did, thankfully. But, Victor and I, we were walking the same, the same path, just, a couple hundred yards apart. So it was hell. It was hell writing this book. But I think that ultimately, shows in the finished project. I say without hyperbole that Prometheus in Chains is the best thing I've ever written. It will probably be the best thing I ever write.
I can think of a couple of other creators that have done this, processing loss and death like this and putting a pen to paper. Last year, Fantagraphics released this special edition of was it Anders Nielsen's The End.
Mm-hmm.
It was a book that he published, oh my gosh, I want to say 10 years ago. It was right after his girlfriend had passed away. And it's a collection of like essays and journal entries and drawings right after she passed. But in the very same way, like not knowing that if he's going to reach somebody out there. Yours is coming from an angle of like, you hope it does.
Yeah.
That these things happen and people have to deal with it. And you pretty much said, yeah, exactly. Like men as a society, or society teaches men dry those eyes.
Yeah, we're not. I think that's the biggest driver of toxic masculinity, and that's a term that gets bandied about way too freely. And there are certain extreme members who have taken that to mean that anything masculine is inherently toxic. And I've never believed that that's the case. I think the fact that emotionally undeveloped men raise emotionally undeveloped boys who become emotionally undeveloped men I think that's the biggest problem. I think we're wrapped up in this whole, overly macho idea for what it means to be a man. And, we're taught to suppress anything that anyone could perceive as weak, any kind of emotion, any kind of distress, anything you're having troubles um, um, dealing with. We're taught to just stuff it in, and I think that's bullshit. That ultimately causes us to you're eventually you're either going to explode or you're just going to fall apart, because we're not built to handle that type of weight alone for long periods of time. Humans are social creatures. We need others. And men, we need each other. We need to be able to talk about the things that we're going through. My grandfather, 36-year Marine Corps career, he lied about his age to join in World War II. And he came out after 2 tours in Vietnam. And he was a very strong advocate for mental health awareness and treatment availability options for Marines. Because unfortunately, the Marine Corps just doesn't encourage that. In some ways, they actually frown upon you seeking treatment for mental health. But one of the most profound things that my grandfather said to me, I was very young. I was probably 11, 12 years old, too young really to understand what he was saying, but it's always stuck in my head. He's like, son, we cannot send boys off to war and ask them to do the things that we need them to do and expect them not to come back broken men. And that statement, it's always just stuck with me. The military, we ask our soldiers, men and women, to do terrible, terrible things that scar them for life. You can't unsee the things that they've seen. And then we don't provide enough mental health resources for them when they come home. That's why there's so many homeless veterans out there, so many veterans suffering from addiction and other mental health issues. And that's a great shame on our country, truly. But yeah, I do hope that things like Prometheus and Chains, and there are a lot of other people working on PTSD advocacy and mental health awareness for men. There are a lot of good people working toward that, and so hopefully, Prometheus and Chains can just add to those efforts. And again, hopefully, somebody, instead of picking up a gun, they pick up a phone.
That's well put. And Josh is bringing up The Crow was the most famous version. Yeah, James Bart, it was very similar. He lost his fiance at a young age, and that's kind of like what led into the creation of The Crow.
Yep. That's one of the most brilliant stories. Actually, is one of the earliest mature comics I ever read. When you go through that period where you've read pretty much every superhero story you can find. You figured out that there are essentially 13 different plots, and they're just playing Barbie dress up with the different characters. And you want to graduate to something with a little more depth and more complex stories. And The Crow was one of the first ones I picked up. I was in class with a kid named Leslie Varley, and he wanted to be a comic book artist. I have no idea whatever happened to him, but he was a good dude. He just transferred in from another school, and he was kind of like us. He was one of the weirdos. Didn't fit in, long hair, wore the big trench coat, had like piercings and stuff. Really rad dude, man. I miss him. But he had the Crow comics with him, and he let me borrow them and read them. And man, I was obsessed. And then so from there, I graduated into Neil Gaiman and Frank Miller and Garth Ennis. God, I was way too young to be reading Garth Ennis. But yeah, I got into those types of people who were telling those underground independent stories and those genre stories, and that's always resonated with me. Capes and tights is just not my thing, but I love genre. I love horror. I love sci-fi. I love fantasy. And there's so many amazing books out there that fall into those genres.
Oh yeah, The Crow was one of those that I remember very much like you, that I would see. I would see that from Caliber Press. I would see the TMNT indie books, Cerebus.
Oh, that's a
Because
great book. Does not get
we,
mentioned often enough.
well, we didn't have a lot of things like, comic book stores took a gamble carrying
Mhm,
independent titles like that, unless you lived in a bigger city. But if you lived in a small town, it was all about Marvel and DC, and I
mhm.
mean, maybe some Disney books in there, but independent books were hardly. I remember going to big cities and finally like finding all these indie books and then local indie books.
Mhm.
But yeah, that was a fun time.
That's why
Ted-
your local comic book store is the most important thing, the most important entity in the comic book industry. They are the heart and the backbone of what we do, because if independent local comic book shop owners didn't exist, everything would feature Bat Dude and Spider Guy and would just be churned out by these giant multinational behemoths who have, I mean, if they could, let's be honest, they would just hire AI to write and draw everything, because they don't care. They don't really care about telling good stories anymore. They just care about packaging stories with action figures and T-shirts that they can sell. I mean, the real work in the comic book industry, and well, not real work, the I think the most profound work that's going to drive the industry forward, or quote unquote save the comic book industry, I think it's the work that's being done in the independent realm, the genre books. I've said this before. I'll stand by it, even though people crucify me for it. Superheroes are dead. They just don't know it yet. Manga and anime have completely cut their legs off and ripped their hearts out. You look around at conventions, the younger generation, they're not wearing Spider-Man costumes. They're not wearing Superman. They're wearing Deku Midoriya and Naruto and Attack on Titan, things like that. Well, Attack on Titan's a little bit too much for the young kids, but I think you get what I'm saying. But where comic books are not losing ground to other mediums is in the genre world. Comic books are still the best way to tell a horror story or a science fiction story or a fantasy story. So I think that's really where the strength of our industry is what's going on in the independent world, and that is dependent upon the local comic book shop, who, like you said, will take the gamble on ordering something new. Local comic book shop owners, they're kind of curators. They read and learn about what's going on in the industry, and then they buy those things that their customers don't really know they're going to ask for yet. It's by getting to know your customers, knowing the industry, knowing the types of creators that are coming out. And if it were all just Target, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, run by Marvel and DC, nobody would care about that. They would just put things out that they know will sell, and we'd be in a very terrible place, in my opinion.
I mean, that's a whole nother subject about the state of comic book stores and the direct market. And yeah, it's, I mean, I always say I've been told comics are dying for 35 years,
Yep.
almost 40 now. So,
Yep.
it's just, I think it's finding your own thing too. Comics are so much more diverse in the stories that they have now. There's so many options. Um, and I don't think there's anything wrong with finding those kind of books through superheroes, because I think
Right.
that's the way most of us found these amazing works, these independent works, through superhero comics. Whether it was somebody working on a book and you realize later, like, oh, they write their own stories. That's cool. Or it was an artist that was working on a book that you see their name later on an indie title, or like you said, maybe a comic book store that
Mhm.
is carrying the book. Right now, your titles are being published through Source Press. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Cult of Dracula and Rise of Dracula were released through Source Point Press.
Hmm.
And then Prometheus and Chains, I decided to take that to Red 5 Comics.
Okay.
Then Reign of Dracula, um, we'll be announcing more about its release date soon. It'll be coming out in early 2024. So got those on the shelves now. Got a couple other books that have not yet been announced, but next year I should have 4 comic series on the shelves in 2024.
Awesome. All from Red 5?
No, some be from Red 5. One's going to be from Blue Juice. One, probably can guess which one. Source Point Press. So yeah, I'm getting to that point where I'm starting to work with a lot of other people. Or letting different companies and things like that. So hopefully, I'll get those. Get to write like a licensed product someday. Maybe I'll get to write a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles story or something. I don't know. But right now I'm doing my own thing, telling my stories, and very fortunate that I can work with a lot of really rad publishers and some amazingly talented artists.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really cool. And now you don't have to live in the same city. You don't have to work together in the same studio. Everybody can.
You don't have to work in the same country. I mean,
yeah.
My cover artist for Cult of Dracula, Gyula Nemeth, was in Budapest, Hungary. My interior artist, Puis Calzado, was in Mexico City. I think my original colorist was in Canada. So yeah, I mean, comics. There's never been more opportunity for creators to create. Because these boundaries, these barriers that existed for so many years. You have to live in New York City. You've got to work here. You've got to go to this coffee house or whatever. Those barriers, they don't really exist anymore because, I mean, hell, you don't even need a publisher anymore. If you've got a good product, a story that you want to tell, that you're willing to put the time, effort, and resources into creating, I mean, hell, you can go straight to Kickstarter and release it. And, on Kickstarter, sometimes you'll make more money than we do releasing a comic in the, through the comic book stores. So
yeah, I've seen people do that. I've seen people go crowdfunding way, which is really cool because that's where we are in this day and age.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive. It's expensive, man, for a creator. A lot of people don't really know this, but so Prometheus and Chains, 16 issues, ultimately cost me just shy of $30,000 to do. 6 issues, 168 pages, so just shy of $30,000 to produce the book. I won't see a penny of that until probably mid 2024. My artist got paid every time he turned in a page. Same with my colorist, same with my letterer. But, as a writer, I don't get paid until the book sells. So I think that's what a lot of what's driving people to Kickstarter, because it's just smart. Rather than spending your own money, spend somebody else's and have an audience already built in that loves your stuff. Kickstarter is freaking amazing.
You mentioned something a little bit earlier I want to go back to, but first, are you planning to continue in horror or other genres?
Horror is always going to be my wheelhouse. I love to tell horror stories. I love to be scared. I'm probably the easiest person on the planet to scare because I desperately want to be scared. So I think I'll always, find my home in horror. However, I am working on a sci-fi story about aliens invading a high school. That's going to be a fun story to tell with a very dark twist. I've got a children's book called Brontosaurus Brown that I'm working on. Hopefully, going to release that first book in 2024 as well. And I was recently invited to pitch a superhero story to one of the 2 major publishers out there. I'm just not allowed to discuss anything more than that about it. So maybe I'll have a Capes and Tights book out next year too. Who knows? Awesome.
Any word of advice that you have for anybody that's trying to write their own book, their own comic?
Finish your script. I saw an interview with Joss Whedon one time, and he said that 80% of every script, screenplay, play script, book script, whatever, 80% of every one of those that gets started never gets finished. So if you finish your script, you're already in the top 20% of every script that project that was written. I think that's a pretty damn good place to be. And you put yourself in that perspective, and all of a sudden you realize this actually is possible. If you tying into that, you have to decide whether you are doing this as a pro or you're doing this as a hobbyist. There is absolutely nothing wrong with either of those decisions, but they're going to require different skill sets. They're going to require different levels of commitment and different time frames. And if you decide that you are going to be a professional, you have to act like a professional. You have to treat it like a job. I have an office in my house that's only for writing. I don't do anything else in there. And I'm there. I clock in every morning at 10 a.m. I work until 1. I go grab lunch. I come back around 3:30, and then I work until 5 or 6. And then I still have those spurts where it's 2 in the morning. I have an idea. I wake up and start writing. But I do every single day. I put myself in the position to be able to create. And most of the time I'm able to create. I have plenty of days where I just sit there and, stare at the wall and bounce a little rubber ball back and forth against the wall because it's just, nothing's coming. But more often than not, just being in that situation, creating that environment, giving yourself the best possible chance to succeed, more often than not, that's led to my success. But treat it like a job if you're going to be a pro. And if you're going to be a hobbyist, there's nothing wrong with that. Just if you're an artist out there and you can't draw a page a day, you're a hobbyist. You're not a pro. If you're a writer and you can't write a script in a week, you're not a pro. You're a hobbyist. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But to be a pro, you've got to put the pro work into it. And that's difficult to do, especially when you're starting out, because, you got to have real jobs and you got to, take care of your family, things like that. It's very difficult in the beginning, but if you're willing and if you're able, it definitely can be done.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those words for anybody that is trying to make it into the comic books industry. So I know you said that you've got other projects coming out next year. You got 4 books and maybe even a Tights and Capes book. Now, any of these books that we've talked about, the Curse of Dracula and any of the ones coming out, are these going to be collected in a collected edition and trade paperback or hardcover edition?
Yeah. So Cult of Dracula and Rise of Dracula, collected editions are the only way you can find them. Every single issue of Cult and every single issue of Rise sold out. So the collected editions, the trade paperbacks, you can find them comic book stores everywhere, Barnes and Noble, Target actually carried it around Halloween, which was insane to me. Anywhere Simon & Schuster books are sold, you can find Cult of Dracula and Rise of Dracula. Prometheus and Chains will get a separate collected edition. And one of the things we'd like to do when we wrap up Reign of Dracula, which will be in 2024, final volume of this Dracula saga, we want to collect it into a collected edition and then either do a slip box set for all 3, Cult, Rise, and Reign, or we want to do like one big collected omnibus edition. We'll know more about that after after Reign has hit the shelves and it's gone through its life cycle.
Well, now you are speaking my language when you said collected edition.
I can tell maybe you like 1 or 2 collected editions back there.
Maybe some big books is what I like. Yes. Rich, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you everybody for watching. And yeah, go and check out his work. It's out there and coming out in 2024 with other titles. Now, is one last question: is Prometheus and Chains, is that all and done? Or you still...
from my perspective, it's done. All 6 issues are written. Jordan just turned in issue 5. That's Jordan Lorenzo's the artist. So those 6 issues will be in the can and off to the printer. Currently, issue 2 just hit shelves last Wednesday. And then issue 3 will come out in October. November will be issue 4, December issue 5, and January issue 6.
Excellent. Okay, just making sure we got the schedule of when that was coming out. So thank you for being here, and thank you everybody for watching. Everyone, stay healthy and safe out there, and keep an eye out for his books.
Thanks, guys. Hey, again, thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Oh, absolutely. Not just the Not just the omnibus or collected or hardcover slipcases. Not just that, but all his books.